This is an analysis of the Prelude by William Wordsworth for the GCSE Poetry Anthology for Power and Conflict. So first, annotations. As you will already know, green annotations are context, purple annotations are structure, and pink annotations are language. So our first contextual analysis are about the fact that this is part of a 14-book poem, so a really epic poem written by William Wordsworth, and it's an autobiographical account of key experiences in his life, and this is just one part of that 14-book poem. Wordsworth himself is considered to be the first romantic poet when he wrote lyrical ballads in the 1700s, so writing at a similar time to Blake, so good for comparison. Unlike Blake, Wordsworth had a privileged rural upbringing, so wouldn't have been exposed to the same sort of horrible incidents perhaps that Blake would have been. And one of the key terms to know for this poem is the sublime, which is a literary term to refer to the romantic awe and sometimes fear of the magnitude of nature. So it's this overwhelming sense of how amazing nature is. So structurally, this is written in blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter, the same as My Last Duchess. And this demonstrates the severity of the subject. The first-person narrative reflects the personal impact of nature. So in the first section, we open with One Summer Evening, which fits with the nice narrative style. It sounds like the opening of a children's book in a way, and this maybe reflects the childhood innocence of the narrator at the beginning of the poem. And the narrator talks about being led by her, and we're not really sure who her is, so it could be nature, it could be a spirit, it could be another person, it could be desire, so we're not really sure. It's completely open to interpretation. There are lots of idyllic pastoral images in this part of the poem, and it's used throughout this part to demonstrate the beauty of nature, or if you're looking at it through a metaphor for childhood, it's the perceived perfection of childhood. It's like when people say, oh, it was always sunny when I was younger, the idea that everything was perfect when you were little. So the narrator steals a boat, and when the narrator does so, they talk about their troubled pleasure, and this oxymoron gives an indication that something's not quite right about how the narrator feels, but they're starting to feel a bit guilty about it. So it foreshadows that something more troublesome might happen later in the poem. And when the boat's moving, it's described as leaving behind her still on either side small circles glittering idly. There's a repetition of the L sound there, and that emphasises the idyllic nature of this setting and makes you think of the lapping water. So it just emphasises and contributes to this feeling of a peaceful setting. And the narrator themselves are described as being quite arrogant, or perhaps naive if you're thinking of them as a young person, that they're really confident, they've stolen a boat, they don't really have any plans, but they think they're really good at rowing, they strike out and they're not worried about what's going to happen to them. So there's that semantic field of confidence with proud of his skill and an unswerving line, fixed my view, sounds really confident. And then at the end of this part of the poem, there's a reference to the horizon's utmost boundary and nothing but the stars and the grey sky. So there's an emptiness there, perhaps suggesting the... So this lulls the reader into a false sense of security about the next image to come. So the boat is described as an elfin pinnace, and that means fairy boat, and this just complements the notion of the idyllic setting, the idea that it seems magical and fairy tale-like. And the narrator again is described as heaving through the water like a swan. So again, there's that confidence through this simile, describing it like a swan, the confidence in moving through the water without much care and with lots of agility. So all in all, we've got the first part of the poem showing how beautiful the setting is, how calm and confident the narrator is, which lulls us into a false sense of security for the next part of the poem. And the next part of the poem, we start with the Volta, so that's the change in tone. This is the transformative moment for the narrator, and this could be where the sublime happens, and there's a huge contrast now between the first part that we've just looked at and this part. So this shows the direct highlight from the bit we just looked at with the reference to Craggy again. So before, Craggy was not really thought much of, it was a positive image, and now we're seeing it turn into a negative image. So the contrast in images from the idyll used to demonstrate the sublime or the dangers of adulthood. So this is now a change in the person who's narrating the story. So there's a repetition of huge when talking about the mountain that the narrator sees. So this adjective really emphasises how intimidating this mountain is. And there's zoomorphism used here to make the mountain seem like a beast or some sort of monster, to make it seem really intimidating and really quite scary. And this is continued throughout this next section with the semantic field of intimidation, so things like grim, towered, it strode after them, so it almost seems like it's being pursued by this mountain. And this just emphasises the power of nature, which you will see in Storm on the Island and Exposure as well. There is then also, as a result of the image that the narrator sees, a contrast with the way that they feel about themselves. So they have lost the confidence and arrogance that we saw in the first part of the poem, and now they are trembling, they're stealing away and they're hiding away. So the stole and the covert shows that they're kind of running back to where they were, or rowing back to where they were and hiding. This contrasts with the previous confidence of the dipped oars, and this could be a reference to the transformative power of nature or the transformative power of turning into an adult from a child. And in the final part of the poem, we see the impact of this event on the narrator. And the impact is mind-altering, and this could reflect the transition to adulthood, that things go or change completely from when you're a child to when you're an adult. And the use of the word grave could actually reference death. So maybe it's a reminder that once childhood is lost and adulthood is imminent, then death is also imminent. We see the psychological impact of the experience, and this is similar to Remain, so almost like a PTSD type experience. It talks about my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense for many days, so it's a long-lasting impact, and it completely alters the way that this person thinks. They also reference a darkness, which could refer to a depression, or perhaps an evilness that came over them, or perhaps a realization that just changes the way that they think. And this perception of nature has also been permanently altered. There's no pleasant image of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields. So a complete contrast to the beginning of the poem, where they were really happy and everything was really idyllic, and now they can't conjure these images anymore, perhaps because they've turned into an adult and they have to realise the evils of the world, or the trials and tribulations of the world, so perhaps they don't have time to see these things anymore. And finally, this last line where they talk about the trouble to my dreams contrasts with the first line, where it's about being on a summer's evening and now it's being in a nightmare basically.